Welcome back. You're watching the Front Row. Thank you for staying with us. We are talking about back to school like no other, first of many, right amid a pandemic. How are we handling it? The guidelines put in place, how are we implementing them? How viable are they? A panel of experts I have here tonight, Professor Helen Inyega, an education policy expert, Mr. Nicholas Mayo, chairperson of the Kenya Parents Association, and Honorable Omboko Milemba, chairperson, KUPPET, and member of parliament for Muhaya. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen and lady. Mr. Omboko Milemba, you were saying something just before we cut you off on the funding question. You started by saying there's a 10% deficit, which then begs the question, how will schools run, given that the Cabinet Secretary has asked these particular institutions not to send any child home for lack of fees?
Thank you. I hope you can now get me well.
Yes, very, very well. Thank you.
Yes. What I was saying is that first I must laud Magoha because he came out to strongly encourage every parent to take their children to school. And that's why, though we know him as a very assertive person, we see him use the word plead. I'm pleading with all heads not to send away the students. That was good of him. And that's what we are also telling our teachers, that go to school and receive those children the way they are. Even if some girls come when maybe they have challenges of even pregnancy, some come without uniform, some come, they have whatever. They don't have a uniform, just accept them. But we are doing this because as leaders we must begin again. And as we begin again, we must put sacrifices in place. But away from that, the challenge of funding will remain a big one in the schools because schools have been given only 20% instead of 30% of the funding in terms of capitation, and yet they have not been given any other money to just deal with COVID situation. I heard Professor who spoke earlier sympathize with government, but the truth is that it's the business of government to run education. And education is actually in our constitution. And it's not only free for primary and basic, but it's also compulsory. So money must be found to just deal with education, including the informal schools in the slums that you talked about. Government must come to Parliament and ask for more funding to actually put in place things that are required in the school setup during this COVID period. That is the truth of the matter, and I think that this government and Kenya has that type of money. Look at the situation we had with the desks. All that money we took to desks should have been taken in a more serious area like the masks. And therefore, I think that the funding must be given by the government. Other challenges we are facing in school would be the teachers, which the government must pay, motivation. Remember, we asked the government to pay the BOM teachers some funding during the COVID period, but they did not pay the ones of primary. They only paid the ones of secondary and left the primary ones. So that will be another challenge. We need motivation. And finally, we shall need also good insurance coverage for the teachers during this period. So,
you mentioned government prioritizing some of the areas that need, and quickly at that, funding. We're talking about 1.9 billion shillings that went into the procurement of prototype desks. We also saw 2.1 billion shillings from what the government said, going to building of additional classrooms. And even in the budget, 2020-2029 financial year, the ministry was allocated 497.5 billion shillings. So funding would likely not be a very big problem. Are you then saying it's an issue of prioritizing the more pressing areas, Mr. Milemba?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. That the risk workers are shifting slowly, hoping that COVID numbers go down from the health sector to the education sector. And therefore, prioritization of funding must now be directed not only in the health, but also the education sector. That is exactly what I mean. And once that is done, then every learner in Kenya should be able to access education and we still support phased reopening.
All right, thank you. I want us to take a look at some of the thoughts, and Mr. Milemba, there's a question for you here, so I'll be coming back to you shortly. Let's take a look at some of the views from our viewers on Twitter before we go on. Seeing a question here by Tom Kim Baraza, who says, ask Honorable Milemba if there will be a risk allowance for teachers during this pandemic. What will happen to learners who will report without school fees, and what will happen to learners in private schools which have closed down? This specifically addressed to Honorable Milemba. And in my inbox on Twitter, Duncan Kochiewa says, to be sincere, there is poor preparation to uphold any emergencies in relation to COVID-19. The students themselves do not adhere to social distancing. Some schools are far in relation to water, rooms and other infrastructure needed. Just a comment there from Duncan Kochiewo, who is joining us. Mr. Milemba, back to you on that response on just taking care of the teachers, because in schools they're now being viewed as the frontline workers. Are they prepared enough? Are we cushioning these teachers?
Thank you. In fact, I like the term frontline workers. Currently now, the teachers are the frontline workers, and therefore, the first thing they require is good insurance that will cover not only the other cases pre-existing, but also COVID, and comprehensively so. So that we shall be asking from the employer as a union. Number two are those schools that students that go to school without fees. I want to treat the plead by the minister as a real plead. But with time, the schools cannot run without money. And where can we get this money from? Either one, the government itself must give enough capitation to schools, including extra that is to deal specifically with COVID cases and COVID pandemic. Or this money must then come from parents. So as we send the students to school, we want to believe that this is just a beginning, but sooner or later, the government should provide money for capitation, and fees will be required. So we are also asking our teachers that in the first week, second week, please don't chase the students away. Try to start going back to normalcy. There's the issue of risk allowance, which I was asked. And as we now become the frontline workers, we are moving to also ask our Employer Teacher Service Commission for this risk allowance. We have been asking it for the science teachers because of the work they do in the laboratories, but now we shall be asking for the entire teaching fraternity. And finally, there was something on the
private schools that were closed down. Yes, yes.
Very good, thank you. The private schools that were closed down. Now we have two categories of schools that were closed down. One are the private schools that cannot go back, and some of them actually told us they are either now changed into rearing chicken, while others cannot just take off. For these ones, we are asking the ministry to quickly take a catalog of these schools, take a catalog of the children who are in these schools, and spread them out in the other schools that are public, that are actually on. This will be very important for the candidates, for equality in preparation of exams. The other category are the schools in parts of Budalangi, Kisumu, and Baringo, of course, where these schools are flooded. The government and the minister must ask for more funding in this sector, specifically to create makeshift schools to accommodate these learners, so that they are not disadvantaged.
All right, thank you. To you, Mr. Mayo, a lot of questions around the priority areas, 1.9 billion shillings going into desks, when some schools still don't have proper water and sanitation infrastructure. Would you then say you would understand parents' anxiety, especially in schools that have not put this into place? And your thoughts on how the government has prioritized some of the areas to do massive funding on in the education sector?
Thank you, Andera. On ministry support or government support to schools, is that for us parents, we thought priority would be social distance. And because of its investment, because it needs a lot of investment, if you take an example of a school like Maranda High School, which has 2,400 students with only 40 classes. For social distancing to be realized in that school, we need another Maranda school to be built, which is next to impossible because it will take maybe another 5 years or even more. So what I think the government did was to assist us with those desks so that we can create space. For example, we can say in Maranda we use our dining hall for learning. We also use some temporary structures, and I think it will be possible because it is cheap and faster, unlike the permanent building that takes a lot of money. So I think as parents also, we can also meet at the school level, because we have a parents association at the school level, and see to it that because every school has its own unique challenges. School A is not like school B. Like a school, this primary school called Olympic, it has the biggest number of students, pupils in the country. When you go to a school, my school in the Eldoret Hill School, for example, the challenge in Hill School is only in the dormitory, because they have enough classes, they have enough water. So every school has its own challenge. In a setup like Hill School, for example, I was talking with the head teacher. I told him we can meet and ask the parents who live around to have those children be day scholars. If we have them to be day scholars, then we will not have congestion in the dorm. That is only for Hill School. When you go to Maranda, we need space. When you go to my other school, Nairobi School, where my son is, we have enough classes, but we don't have, the dorms are fewer. So every other school has its own unique challenges. So I'm requesting the parents that we should be very close at this time of pandemic to the teachers, to the parents, the BOM and the PA in school, so that all of us can see what we can do in that particular time at that particular place. Because a school in Shimbalatewa has its own unique challenges. A school in Kwale, a school in Wajir, a school in Turkana. Like now we have our school in Baringo flooded. About 7 primary schools and 4 high schools, totally flooded. Now children will not, unless they'll be transferred elsewhere, they'll not have a place to learn. So I'm urging every parent to make sure that you are very close to your school where your child is, so that you also know what are the challenges in that school, and we can assist by maybe talking to these partners, to these donors, and our schools will be fair enough, because this challenge actually is not an educational problem, but it is a health issue.
Professor Nyega, I'd like you to speak on this as an education policy expert and also someone who really advises on issues to do with basic education. But I'd like to tie that in with a comment I've seen on Twitter. Let's quickly just take a look at what Nahashon says. He says, how can these nice policy statements translate into nice and timely resources for the deprived and COVID-19 battered schools, both public and private, to serve the learners streaming back to these institutions? How can these nice policy statements translate into nice and timely resources for the deprived and COVID-19 battered schools? Professor Nyega, for you.
I think that is the constant challenge we have to deal with, really. I do not know that there is an easy answer to that question, but we have to start somewhere, because the ministry has already put in place plans for the children to come back to school. They have recalled the principals to come back to school. They have recalled the teachers to come back to school. They have laid everything to the best of their ability. We need to pick up our pieces from where we left off. As the minister rightly said, the CS said that, in terms of the curriculum, will have to begin from where they left off. So we have to begin somewhere. I know it's not going to be easy. Yes, everything usually looks very nice on paper in terms of theory. When it comes to practice, that is where the challenge begins. As my colleague Mayo has said, really we need to work very closely with schools as parents, working with the teachers and the principals to ensure that there is infrastructure within the school. The government will provide the funding, and Honorable Milemba rightly said they have money. They'll definitely, and it has already been sent to school, some bits of it, 20%, there's 10% remaining. I know we need to keep going as a country so that we sense there's movement. I know there will be challenges in terms of even the teachers, how they handle the students. That is where now the Teacher Service Commission and Ministry of Education need to come together to even work with teachers in terms of building their capacity as well, to be able to look at this curriculum anew, because it seems to me we are going to compress the time, we are going to be able to cover a lot of ground within a shorter time. Teachers need to actually innovate in terms of what is going to be happening in the classroom. They need all the support that they can get from the Ministry of Education, from even the parents, so that they are able to do a good job. Secondly, in terms of psychosocial support, the principals, the teachers, and the children need psychosocial support. We cannot just assume they are okay. There's still fear amongst the people who are coming to school, the children. They're not sure whether they're going to be safe. The teachers are not sure they're going to be safe. So we need a lot of psychosocial support provided to the teachers and the children within the school, so that we also seem to be moving together. So I know from policy, we have laid out the infrastructure, everything is looking good, but in practice, there's more that will need to be done. The question that the schools are battered, remember even before COVID, the schools were not at the same place. We found that some schools were better endowed than others. The disparities are likely to continue. They're actually worsening because of COVID-19. Many parents have been laid off. So even when we say the parents are going to support schools, as Mayo has said, some of them don't even have the resources to even buy the simple masks for 100 shillings, the reusable ones. So I know it's an ever-present challenge. The government, we expect it to step up to the challenge and do its part. And while the teachers are in the school, they also do their part. They encourage the children, they also encourage each other. So we have to have systems in place within schools to ensure that we are moving forward with whatever resources we have at hand. Mm-hmm. We have to really move forward.
Okay. All right. Before we take a break, I'd want to take a look at something else I've seen on our Twitter handles just now, for you to be able to address that before we go on a short break. I don't know if we have that tweet or we should wait for. Okay, we'll be getting it in a short while. So Soliot Michael says, our children sleep in the same dormitory for 8 hours without masks. We should open schools the Magufuli way. And there's another one, I think we will be seeing it a bit later. But when we talk about boarding schools, Professor Inyega, it's likely that we need to be a little bit more careful with these boarding schools. The government has asked parents who can have their children go on day schools do so. But even be that as it may, how should we then behave with boarding schools and with restricted funding, so to speak, in terms of how we handle it?
It's actually very tricky. As I said earlier, I don't envy anyone running schools. But that said, I'm sure they will need to think creatively again and innovate in terms of the resources they have within schools. My colleagues have said earlier that they could use dining halls, maybe the labs, maybe put some makeshift tents within the school compound to be able to manage the number of the children. And now somebody has mentioned about being able to use the dormitories And we know with the 100% transition, there was already overcrowding in the dormitories with triple deckers. So if all the children were to come, it will even be more challenging. Now it's not going to be as challenging because we only have class 4 in the primary schools and class 8. And in high school, we only have form 4. But picture a scenario where all the children have come back to school. It's not going to be easy. And for me, even from a health perspective, wearing a mask for 8 hours and then at night you're not wearing, the risks are actually there. Whether you're wearing the mask, breathing within the mask for 8 hours is something not healthy. And at the same time, if you're in the dormitory and you're not using the mask, the risk actually becomes higher. So these are teething challenges that do not have easy answers, and we cannot pretend that we have begun to solve them. But as I said earlier, we need to start somewhere. Schools need to start where they are with the resources they have, and then as time goes by, hopefully things will improve. I was just saying earlier that in terms of COVID-19, it does have challenges, but it's an opportunity to right some of the wrongs that we had in our education system. For example, the issue of not having appropriate infrastructure within the schools. I wish now we would take advantage of the situation and actually put in place measures, both at government level and at BOM level, school committee level, to be able to think differently about how schooling is organized. Even in terms of the curriculum, how should the curriculum be organized so that in the event that we have a calamity or an emergency like the one we had, learning can go on.
All right.
What alternative learning resources can we use? So I think there's a lot that we can do within the school.
What alternative learning resources can we use? We'll be getting back to that. Let's take a look at what our audience are saying. As usual, I keep saying this is their show too. So let's see what are some of their comments and questions. Major Buni says, what plan does the government have for these special schools as far as the COVID-19 is concerned? Disability is a challenge here, and parents won't and can't support. Again, is there special funding for these schools? Mr. Mboko, because you're in constant consultation with the government, I think you might help us shed more light on this. Let's take a look at another comment. Steve Ogat says, what if COVID-19 surges in schools? How will you explain this? I think any of our panelists can pick this. And even as we've seen in other countries where schools were opened, but they were forced to shut back again. So what plan do we have for this? And finally, Shadrach Mbithi says, Shadrach, please ask Mr. Milemba about the fate of diploma secondary teachers who are teaching in high schools, about stagnation at job group K, and TSC not recognizing their degree certificate. Mr. Milemba, I hope you are able to get that question. I'd like us to take a quick break. When we get back, we see some of your views. But even as we continue to critique how the government has gone about this, what solutions are there to seal some of these gaps and systemic failures in the education sector that have been there for years and now being compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic? Stay with us. You're watching The Front Row.